Looking at how our rosters that we drafted back in August, some of them back in June, Shawn, some of those best ball rosters probably all the way back to February, lots of teams, lots of players that we've discussed throughout the offseason and throughout the season. How are they doing now? We have had a lot of people asking us to do kind of a mid-season review. Shawn was traveling. There was lots of different things going on in my life. Didn't get to it really, but we're going to do sort of a show a little bit like that today as we look at the kind of taking stock of how things are now as we move in to the portion of the season where it all comes down to you want to have yourself set up good at this point that you have a chance to take home those fantasy championships if you're playing in big money leagues or if you're playing in big basketball tournaments and so on and so forth. You want to be able to be in a shot to get those top prizes. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. We're also going to talk a little bit about Monday Night Football to kick things off here. I'll say, Shawn, a pretty fun but pretty unique game in the way this one played out. Denver get the field goal early on. They get a few turnovers. They have trouble punching it into the end zone, but halftime, it is a case that it's 15-8. Still turnover issues here for the Buffalo Bills, and they end up losing this one 24-22 in favor of Denver. Denver now 4-5. The Bills 5-5. It looked like the Bills were going to scrape this one out at the end, but we did kind of joke a little bit about the way that the Washington Commanders managed the end of that Seahawks game and the Seahawks with the walk-off field goal. Well, what Ron Rivera did say after the game is exactly what happened here, where they left too much time on the clock and Russell Wilson led the team to a field goal, although there was a number of flags on this series. One, a deep shot, which led to the penalty to kind of get them into field goal range. And then after missing a field goal, there was a 12 men on the field, which, Shawn, in professional sports, you just cannot be having on the last play of the game to give the team an opportunity to hit another field goal. That led to the 6th walk-off field goal of NFL Week 10, which is a record in NFL history, the most walk-off field goals in a single game. History, Shawn, has been made a number of times this season, which I think has made it a lot of fun, even small things like that. But we talked about CeeDee Lamb and his history making exploits. We had AJ Brown. There's just so many players doing incredible things. Speaking of history, the touchdown pass to Courtland Sutton in this game, Shawn, had a probability of completion of 3.2% from Next Gen Stats. That is the lowest and most improbable completion of the Next Gen Stats era. 7-yard touchdown should not have a pass completion probability of 32%. That is because Russell Wilson scrambled for 16.3 yards. It was a 37.8 yard pass attempt, and the distance from the sideline was 0.7. So actually minus 0.7 because the ball was actually outside off the sideline when it was caught. So pretty incredible play. Since that game, the Bills have relieved offensive coordinator Ken Dorsey of his role. Quarterbacks coach Joe Brady will serve as the interim offensive coordinator. So, Shawn, lots of things happened in this. We mentioned on the Monday recap show that we did want a performance out of Javonte Williams, and we did see that in this one. We also had Courtland Sutton 8 for 53 and that touchdown on 11 targets. Not a huge else to talk about outside of those two guys. Javonte Williams, 21 rush attempts for 79 yards, and then he also had 4 for 31 and a touchdown as well. Stephon Diggs didn't really get it going in this one with 5 targets. Dalton Kincaid, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 51 yards, and a touchdown for him. James Cook with one of the more interesting plays, Shawn. He did have 12 rush attempts for 109 yards, the long being 42, but he did have a fumble that managed to bounce directly into his hands, and he continued on his way before being tackled. What were your takeaways from Monday Night Football this week?
As you mentioned, this was a fascinating game. So many twists and turns. It was not a well-played game, but for a game with this many, we might say foibles, it was a lot of fun. Most of the NFL games that are not well-played are not this exciting, this enjoyable all the way through. And I do think we have to start with that Courtland Sutton catch, which is one of the all-time great plays, if only because he did manage to get his feet in a situation where it just seemed impossible. The look of it was not of a catch. And yet, as soon as you see the second angle, I think he caught it. I think they're going to have to overturn that. And they do.
It reminded me, Shawn, because it was Russell Wilson throwing it, but over the years, we've seen Tyler Lockett pull off a number of catches like that where it just seemed impossible, where he drags the toes behind. That's what Sutton managed to do here.
And it was good for him that he made that play, because otherwise it was another example of why they probably would prefer to have someone other than Courtland Sutton in that role. He has a big drop. He has a bad fumble. And the rest of his play really could have cost them this game. I do think it's tricky when you come down to the end here, and he has 11 targets. Jerry Jeudy and Marvin Mims combined for only 4. Now, Jeudy is targeted on the play where if Russell Wilson has any arm strength left, he throws an easy touchdown, but doesn't. And then that leads to kind of the unfortunate pass interference on the Bills, where, I mean, that's one where it definitely is a pass interference, and yet you feel for the defensive back in that situation. You feel for Buffalo in terms of losing the game. As the commentator said, I mean, they don't really deserve this to win this game with all of the mistakes that they did make. It's another good example of how, any NFL game can be lost. The Buffalo Bills now in absolute free fall. You think about where they were, just a month ago when they're coming off hammering that Miami Dolphins squad who was so hot coming in. And the talk after that game was that Buffalo was the best team in the NFL. The talk now is that they are in trouble even in terms of making the playoffs. Now, the other interesting thing here is that suddenly the AFC East looks like one of the weaker divisions in football. And, I certainly would say coming into the week that the Kansas City Chiefs, my team, have benefited from having such a soft division. And yet the Broncos win on the road. The Raiders have, a win that they, the New York Jets definitely shouldn't allow them to get. The Los Angeles Chargers look really good in a loss to the Lions. And unfortunately for the Chargers, that's kind of been their MO over the last 3 seasons. They look really good and they lose. And yeah, you definitely wouldn't want to play the Chargers. Justin Herbert and company could beat you at any point. So it's interesting to track how these divisions are working out as it relates to strength of schedule. One of the things that the Bills now have to contend with is their remaining schedule is absolutely brutal. And so from that perspective, they needed this game and they need to make a move. It'll be interesting to see the direction that they go. Now, Latavius Murray did run more effectively in this game than he has a lot of the season. And yet it seemed to me that the Bills really hurt themselves by taking Cook out after that early fumble. Now, the early fumble looked to me like a situation where you probably have forward progress in his play, and especially on that drive where he more or less brings them back and puts them in position to win single-handedly. That gives you a sense of what he can do and why he has to be out there and why he has to be an offensive focal point. And at the same time, a team that is having trouble where Josh Allen is throwing a lot of picks, and not just picks, but bad picks. You've got to be able to lock down the rest of it. Your running backs have to come through for you and not make mistakes. To have 2 fumbles, to come back with a second fumble in the game after you've already been benched for it, that part is tough. It's so weird to see the passing game collapse here. When teams are able to take away Stephon Diggs like the Broncos did in this one, then suddenly Josh Allen and company just don't have that same level of dynamism, and they feel very mistake prone when they can't rely on Diggs. Now, he himself probably had a poor game in this one, needs to be a little bit sharper. You have the broken play where Dalton Kincaid scores the touchdown. He, again, I think is going to be the clear number 2. Gabe Davis goes for 56 yards in this game, but only 2 of 6. Has not just a drop, but has a ball go through his hands in which it does end up as an interception. Kincaid emerging, I think, is the real bright spot for Buffalo, and the fact that they still have a lot of talent, right? You have Josh Allen, but you have James Cook, one of the more electric running backs. You have Stephon Diggs. You now have this rookie tight end emerging. Those are the pieces that you need. And so I do think with Joe Brady here as the interim offensive coordinator that they are going to take off. They're going to score a lot of fantasy points. One of the things I'm sure that Ken Dorsey is sitting there looking at is like, I didn't fumble those balls. I wasn't Gabe Davis, letting that ball go through for the interception. I'm not Josh Allen making the terrible read on the other pick. And the team here actually averaged 7.1 yards per play. They averaged 3 more yards per play than the Denver Broncos in this game. I mean, this is about as lopsided as you could possibly get in terms of the gap in per play efficiency in a game where the team with the lower amount actually won the game. And part of that poor per play efficiency was our guy, Javonte Williams. He carries 21 times, only gains 79 yards. And basically this entire game until the very end was giving me Travis Etienne flashbacks, where I'm like, why are you pounding him into the offensive line every time? There are so many players there, offensive players, defensive players. Now, we do see as they go in for the go-ahead touchdown late, you do see their offensive line finally start to get a little bit of a push, and Williams makes some plays, gets down there in close, and is able to score then on a short yardage touchdown where the Bills are selling out to stop the run. They flare him out. Russell Wilson makes a nice pass to him. A little bit like the situation with Brian Robinson in Washington. It's been great to see that Javonte Williams has been involved in the receiving game, despite the fact that Samaje Perine is the main back in receiving situations. So even though Perine is always deployed in those, he's in for most of the third downs, he's in the 2-minute drill. He finishes with 3 targets here. He does look very good. He helps them on that final drive. But Javonte having such a high snap count, you can pull up the Monday review tool and see that his snaps over the last couple of weeks have been through the roof. Obviously, to get to the overall workload that Williams has gotten to, where this is his second consecutive game with 20-plus carries. This is the workload that we were expecting from him. It's not the dynamism necessarily that I was expecting from him. Hopefully that part will come. Right now, he's a little bit more almost of that type of profile that we tend to avoid, where the back isn't getting great situations, isn't making big plays himself, and yet this workload at the price, especially as an emerging player here, contrasting what he's doing now with the workload to where he was in the first month and a half, where they obviously were trying to either A, limit him a little bit as he comes back from the injury, or B, trying to figure out where their bread is buttered on offense. More or less what they've decided here is that it's not Russell Wilson. I mean, Wilson plays about as good a game as you can, given the context. He completes 24 of 29, but averages less than 7 yards per attempt, in part, Colm, because everything, and I mean absolutely everything, right up until basically that last Jerry Jeudy heave that, again, you pick up the DPI on, everything is just at the line of scrimmage or behind the line of scrimmage. There's no threatening teams down the field. We were promised a little bit more Marvin Mims. Mims, again, looks very dynamic in special teams, but only draws the one target and doesn't catch it. He is involved in a somewhat unfortunate gadget play where he loses 3 yards as a runner. There were so many times in this game where I was wondering if this was actually Sean Payton, because it looked like one of the least creative and least reflexive in terms of looking at the situations, reacting, and making moves that would allow his offense to attack what the defense was doing. Really of any game that I've seen in a long time. And it does make you think back to his situation, even sort of pre-Drew Brees there with the New Orleans Saints, where his reputation, a little bit like the situation right now, I guess, with Ken Dorsey, was at something of a low tide. I mean, you know that this is the case, but a lot of what he accomplished there with the Saints is based on having that quarterback in Drew Brees. It's not to say that Sean Payton doesn't deserve any of what happened, in the same way that, obviously Bill Belichick deserves a lot of credit for what he was able to do with Tom Brady. I think you've got to really like what Russell Wilson has done in the game. I think that you really have to like what Javonte Williams has done. And yet this is a team, even as they claw back to respectability, that has a lot still to work on. And as we're looking at Javonte Williams, I think we want to be excited about the volume, excited about the fact that they have used him as a receiver. He's now scored receiving touchdowns on consecutive weeks, which only happens if that's part of the game plan. You can get that play in there in the green zone. I mean, obviously some backs are coming out in those situations where that just isn't part of the plan. And yet we have to be, I think, in the same way that if you have Jerry Jeudy right now, you're not excited about the Denver Broncos. I think we have to be somewhat restrained in thinking about Wilson and Williams and Courtland Sutton, certainly Sean Payton at the head of this thing. But Colm, Williams is one of our backs, and it does lead us into this conversation of how we structured things in 2023 and looking into whether or not that's working. Colm, you and I were kind of exchanging some draft boards before the show. I enjoyed doing that. We're going to mention a few of those now. The development that I'm probably most excited about is that the 7 teams in the FFPC main event, so the most important teams there, all 7 of them are currently in playoff position. So the 7 teams that I drafted with you and with Blair and with Ben, they're all in the mix there. What were we trying to do in these leagues in 2023? And what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of this plan as we're now through 10 weeks? So we have 2 more weeks in the FFPC redraft formats. We have 4 more weeks in Dynasty. We have 4 more weeks in Best Ball. And depending on listeners' leagues, they probably have either 4 or 5, depending on your format. So you're either right there on the precipice or you still have a month to maybe make your push. And Colm, we have some best ball teams that have been surging. And so with another full month, especially if you're getting a Justin Jefferson back, especially if you're getting an Achane back, you're thinking that month is probably exactly what I need to get back in the mix and to get over the top as these players come together.
Exactly. And there's obviously some teams, Shawn, that won't be doing as well. That's, when you're drafting a portfolio, that can be the case, whether it's injury related. We did draft quite a few of those. Aaron Rodgers double stacked with Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, with obviously Rodgers going down in the first play of the season. That doesn't help in super flex formats where you've drafted 2 quarterbacks. You can get into challenges, but you have to know that going in. And you ask the question, what are we doing in terms of what were we trying to achieve? Something that we talked about a lot this offseason, Shawn, was the opening rounds in particular, and how the 3rd through 6th round opened up a lot of opportunities for specific running back targets. And the other part that allowed us to do is to focus on the talent that is in round 1 and round 2 that were the priority targets for us. That led to a lot of leagues where, for example, in our main event, the 1-2 turn was Amon-Ra and CD Lamb team. So you're at the moment, you couldn't be in a better position probably at the wide receiver position based on health and how things have gone over the last couple of weeks. And that led into other priority targets that would have been there, the likes of a Garrett Wilson, depending on where you were drafting, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill. AJ Brown wasn't a priority target for us, Shawn, but based on where he could go, would fit into the mold. But that then led things to give us chances to go in and get players like Javonte Williams, who you're after talking about. Ramondre Stevenson was a prime target. Jamar Gibbs was available in that range. Breece Hall was available there. Travis Etienne has stood out up until this week. The last couple of weeks have been massive for him. And then that allowed us to go into some of the favorite tight end targets. And Shawn, when we say favorite tight end targets, we mean Sam Laporta and Sam Laporta. He was our favorite tight end targets, plural. But it also gave us the opportunity a lot of the time to bypass some of the elite quarterbacks, which in previous years could have been very detrimental to your chances. And you talked about this last week on OT about the scoring ranges for some of those elite guys this year versus what the other guys are being able to put up. But, the likes of Jared Goff being in play in that range, and our other priority quarterback target, and Sam Howell. But lots of options that are in there. And then that allowed at the back end of the draft to also add in some of those 0 RB running back targets, but also to add in the young rookie players, and this isn't at the back end necessarily, but some of the players that may not have found their way truly in this season. The likes of a JSN, a Quentin Johnson. You mentioned Marvin Mims, who would be on a lot of our rosters. But a lot of players who, while currently, if we look at the landscape, things haven't clicked perfectly for them. Some of these shoots are bigger for some than others, but there is still possibilities that those players surge as the season comes to a conclusion here, and even adds to the firepower of this roster. But the main goal was to focus on the wide receivers in round 1 and round 2. And to be honest, in previous years we have had massive hits in round 1 and round 2, but this season, Shawn, it feels like more so than previous years. It seems to be kind of a golden year, it feels like, for those elite wide receiver talents. And then the running backs that were available felt like something at the time with the dead zone, like maybe this is the wrong thing to do, and it may still not work out to lead to fantasy championships. But it feels like that kind of theory in the preseason and the offseason was right. And we did get a lot of pushback, and there was a lot of jokes coming in regarding the father of zero RB hyping all the running backs in the dead zone. But how are you feeling about what we try to achieve? Do you think I've covered that okay? Is there anything you want to add into it? And then how is that kind of working out for us thus far?
I think that's a great summary. And it goes back to this question of how are you going to meet the puzzle of the given year, and can you solve that? Understanding that things change, understanding that the draft landscape evolves. And one of the things that I hope listeners have gotten from the show through the years is that you can use the RotoViz tools to evaluate the likelihood of scoring in different parts of the draft, and to evaluate your chances to win the race to fill the flex, and to dominate that with structural drafting, knowing that you do need to have some individual player takes, and we feel pretty good about those takes, not only in 2023, but going back through the seasons. But even as you're kind of managing that portfolio that may be weighted pretty heavily to certain guys, the structure is going to matter, because where your player targets are going and how much they cost relative to their position is going to be a little bit different in different seasons. In the big move that we got this year, to where you can pull up the Win the Flex tool, you can pull up Dave's range of outcomes tool and look at what ADP implies for the different positions. You can look at what the historical player matches tell you about how likely the guys in certain ranges are to score at a particular level. That really helps you calibrate your expectations in a way that I think we can sometimes get lost with when we're looking at projections that focus more specifically on individual players and individual teams. Not saying that those are wrong, because one of the things that we know right now is that the wealth of really good projections out there has tightened up ADP in some ways, and certainly within positions. But you also get this big move, and you really have gotten a sea change because the analysis of best ball has come through, has been able to say, look, basically what RotoViz has been preaching for a decade is not just right, but it's so overwhelmingly right that drafters need to adjust. And then once we got those adjustments, it opens up some different opportunities. So then you go back and you look at it and say, well, how can I take advantage of the structural elements and then potentially tweak that to put together some of these super rosters? So you look at the main events that we have, and one of the things that is the most fun is that now you have these rosters with that wide receiver start. You and I have one of the luckiest ones, one of the best ones there with CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown, but I have similar versions with A.J. Brown. One of the teams that Ben and I have was locked out of Amon-Ra and went that direction. Obviously, we have a lot of Garrett Wilson, which I kind of think that he would be pushing the CeeDee Lamb scoring range if Aaron Rodgers were the QB. So you go through and you have that wide receiver start, and then you have running backs like the names that you mentioned, obviously Travis Etienne being up there, Ken Walker, a guy I don't believe that you did mention, who has been scoring extremely well. And we have so many of those different players to where we have 3 or 4 guys on each team, which number one helps you overcome some of the injuries. So you think about the 3 really unfortunate things that have happened this season. Now, there are unfortunate things that you could argue we have more control over, in that some of the receivers we needed to have hit in that 5, 6, 7, 8 range have not hit or have not hit yet. And that's an ongoing issue, right? But you look at the things that maybe were outside of our control that really have shifted things in a way that is, very frustrating, very sad. And yet all fantasy managers are dealing with some version of this, at least to some extent. But you look at the 3 main things. J.K. Dobbins going down. He was someone we had a ton of exposure to. And if you go from the 3 or the 4 down to the 2 or the 3, that obviously impacts your ability to start running backs who are going to dominate during those specific bye weeks. Certainly have some teams, so Christian McCaffrey and Travis Etienne, have the same bye week, where losing J.K. Dobbins was a real dagger.
Just on this, not just about having a multitude of running backs, because I do think that I'm sure there's new listeners that come in all the time that haven't heard what we've talked about in the past and talk about the profiles of running backs that we're trying to draft. And we're talking now about, having 3 running backs. So if you lose one, you're down to 2. Those are some of the conversations that people would have had, 4 or 5 years ago about, start your draft with 3 or 4 running backs, get the running backs in case running backs get injured, and replace wide receivers later on. But for people who may not have been here for those conversations in the offseason, it was a specific list of players with a specific profile that were available at a specific cost. So we felt they were all undervalued by a number of picks, or in some cases multiple rounds, and then they also fit the profile. So there's a lot of players that are going in that same range, the likes of an Alexander Madison, for example, or an Aaron Jones or Miles Sanders, that just were simply not targets for us. Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry as well, Joe Mixon, they would all have been players in the same range as I share this draft board that we're talking about that wouldn't have been in that. So specific players, specific running backs, specific profiles at specific prices, a lot of specifics.
Exactly. And I think that's a good way to express it. It's so much different if you're getting that guy in round, like if Stevenson 4, was round 5, round 6, than if you're having to pay the 1-2 term prices.
Yes.
Because again, that's that difference between paying up for that player and having him having the requirement that he score at the level that Amon-Ra and CeeDee Lamb are scoring, but not only that, losing the ability to draft those guys. And so it's a completely different draft environment, and one that was very exploitable, in part because the receivers who were going in that range, in those same ranges who were drafting these running backs, were not interesting because of how much they had been pushed up. So, you go back to the sort of the 3 big daggers this season. Would be number 1, J.K. Dobbins injury. Number 2, the Aaron Rodgers injury, which has had cataclysmic events for Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, 2 of our most heavily drafted players. And then the injury to Devin Achane, somebody that we had a ton of and was going to hit, because the draft doesn't end then. Once you get your vaguely starting lineup set after 8 rounds, you definitely need all of those hits. And so when you have a lot of exposure to a guy who looks like he's going to be a top 5 running back, and then he misses a month, especially after he misses the beginning of the season as well, now you're focusing on just such a narrow band of games where he was actually able to play for you. That portion of it really hurts. Now, there have been other things that happen, like losing a Justin Jefferson, that basically has happened globally. It's the people who had the 101 are suffering through that. And so you have that on some teams, you have that, not on most of your teams. There are some other elements there, but those are the 3 things that you have to overcome. And so then the question is, can you do it? And did you draft well enough overall to do it? Colm, one of the most entertaining teams, and I got a little funny note from Connor a couple of days ago saying that once Aaron Rodgers was back here in a couple of weeks, we were going to win the whole thing, because we have a team with Aaron Rodgers and Desmond Ridder. So a lot of, basically you're not scoring any running back or any QB points at all. And it is now up to 3rd. It is, I believe, less than 10 points out of second. And this was a team that started CeeDee Lamb, Garrett Wilson, Ramondre Stevenson, Keenan Allen. And Keenan Allen has been sort of low-key, or maybe not that low-key. I mean, he's scored an absolute ton of points, where the emphasis on him in a range where basically every other wide receiver was a massive landmine has been huge for the portfolio overall. Then Kyle Pitts, again, not a huge hit. Javonte Williams, JSN, Mike Evans, the other sort of veteran hit there, where one of the things that we talked about this season is that the wide receiver inflation was so severe, and yet it didn't make a lot of sense where Keenan Allen and Mike Evans were going. If anything, you could argue that they should have been drafted in the same place that they had been previously. Treylon Burks, another miss, obviously, there. But Sam Laporta, Aaron Rodgers, Devin Achane, Rashawn Johnson, Rashee Rice, Ritter, then Trey McBride, and Mike Gesicki. Colm, this is going to come back to the familiar refrain, where so much of this season for us in best ball comes down to Sam Laporta and Trey McBride. And this is where the structural drafting element, especially in best ball, comes into play. If you are a RotoViz subscriber, you've used the tools that help you work through what's happened in the past, and you're a big fan of the Roster Construction Explorer, you know that continuing to hammer that tight end position is incredibly important. And so this is a team where we take Kyle Pitts early, but we don't rely on that exclusively. Having Laporta, having McBride helps us deal with the situation where the wide receivers have some firepower. You have Lamb, you have Wilson, you have Keenan Allen, and you have Mike Evans. So that's 4 big ones. But you also have some misses in there. And you also have a miss really for your first tight end. And so it's being able to, number one, understand the player profiles, and number two, understand the structural drafting elements that are so crucial that allows this team to stay competitive without quarterback scoring and with Achane going out. And so, Colm, one of the things, again, we kind of mentioned this in the intro, but it's probably the most fun part of 2023 is that there are a lot of drafters out there who have a Justin Jefferson, who have a Devin Achane, who maybe have the situation with the New York Jets and Aaron Rodgers, where they're thinking, if my overall build is strong enough, and I'm getting some of those points, and maybe specifically I'm getting some of those points from a Trey McBride, for example, somebody who's surging right now. If I can get this roster into the playoffs, I may be a little unique. Now, I mean, there are going to be some other drafters out there too who are in the same situation who are also going to get some Justin Jefferson or some Devon Achane, or maybe even some Aaron Rodgers teams across the line. It's still probably a pipe dream that Aaron Rodgers plays in a way that matters. And yet, if you can do that, then I think the end of 2023 has the potential to be wild in a way that, I mean, Colm, you think back to 2021, where it was our 0 running back targets who hit during the fantasy playoffs, hit during the race in those final 3 weeks.
One of them hit this last week, Shawn. I joked that it hadn't happened yet for Rashad Penny, but Devin Singletary, he's starting his run already.
30 carries this week. That's what you can do when you're playing with CJ Stroud.
Myself and Zachary Kruger, we like to have DM chats back and forth on certain players. And last offseason, we had a Tony Pollard, Devin Singletary conversation, and he told me that his name should be changed to Devin Singletary rather than Devin Singletary. So every time something happens, we have a joke about Singletary, but this past week he was Devin 30 carry. So that was impressive. I popped up on the screen here for anyone watching the video on the YouTube side, Shawn, as well. And you made a point there that we probably don't reference enough at this point of the season is what the RotoViz tools and the advice and the information that we're able to take from the historical data to show what works in these formats. The other part that you mentioned is, being able to build a roster. We talk so much about roster construction and how to be able to manage when things don't go well. So I've pulled up the team that we drafted as well with Dave Filippi on the show, and he was kind enough a few weeks ago to remind me that we had Cade Otton on this roster. But not only that, Shawn, this is a roster I think is very uniquely built in how we went to it, and we did have some pressure moments during this draft, and this team is currently in first in its individual league, and the teams that do qualify for the playoffs and continue hopefully towards some finals. I will share those again as the season goes on, but if you check out the episode that he was on, this is the roster we drafted. But when I looked at this week and recapping some of these teams, and I look and, Devontae Smith hasn't really hit. It is a Tyreek Hill team, but Smith hasn't really hit on a continuous basis. T. Higgins hasn't hit on a continuous basis, but they've had big weeks at times. Jahan Dotson fits that profile. Quentin Johnson up until this week, we hadn't seen a huge amount of him. Bateman, similar. Mims, similar. But when we look at it as well, it also is a Justin Fields team, and Fields has missed a chunk of the season here, but it has Sam Howell as his quarterback. It is a Devin Achane team, which surged it at the start, but now he has missed time. But it also is Brian Robinson, Breece Hall, DeAndre Swift. So loaded at the running back position, even without having Achane in there or Achane. And then the difficult part of this roster was building out that tight end room, and Trey McBride, Cade Otton, Mike Gesicki, Hunter Henry, Tyler Conklin have all spread it around for them. So a team that when you look at it on paper, you're probably like, not working out great for Smith, not working out great for Higgins. Breece Hall has lost his quarterback, not working out great. Justin Fields missing a huge chunk of the season, not ideal. Dotson didn't start the season strong. Swift has been very good. Johnson, again, not great. Brian Robinson, great. Bateman, not great. Marvin Mims, not getting as much work as we would like. And this team's in first place in this league because of the way it is built out and the way the roster is constructed to try and give it as much upside as possible. But now that it's in first place, it's also getting Achane back. Justin Fields will be coming back. Players like Devontae Smith or T. Higgins, I still have faith that we're going to see them step up a bit here before the end of the season and have some spike weeks there as well. So I think this is a great example of how trying to construct the roster from back to front and get all those elements in there is working out for the specific team.
And Colm, one of the things that we do emphasize, and again, it's going to have both strengths and weaknesses. It's going to have both advantages and disadvantages for you. So I don't want to portray it as something that is a win-only type of approach.
Yeah.
The emphasis that we have with our drafting strategy, and we try and put out a variety of strategies, all of which are among the top strategies, and help listeners choose the ones that fit the risk-reward profile that works for them and that fits their own strengths as drafters. But you look at this team, and really so much of it relies on the fact that we're getting quarterback scoring from Sam Howell. And I know that as the season has progressed, there have been time periods where listeners have been frustrated with us for getting them so much Sam Howell, and time periods, especially recently, where they're ecstatic that they have so much Sam Howell. It's crazy to me to look through my underdog teams and to see like how you can see how your points are actually hitting the starting lineup there. And the Sam Howell points are crazy. And that includes against the QB1 that you drafted for the vast majority of those teams, right? And so Howell has kept us in the mix here, as have some of those running backs. It's interesting because, Brian Robinson hasn't felt like a pure hit, and I had some teams this week where I didn't start him, and
but as a zero RB in the 9th round, again, I think it's context of where you drafted at the price.
Yeah, you're looking at the overall running back scoring through 10 weeks, and it does help him that he's played in 10 weeks. But my claim for Brian Robinson in 2023 was that he was going to be this year's Josh Jacobs. And while that is not exactly the case when we think about Josh Jacobs' 2022 season, which we're really referencing, it's sort of hilarious to look at them together back-to-back in the running back scoring leaderboard, where Josh Jacobs has 147 and Brian Robinson has 144. So at least from one perspective, Brian Robinson has been the 2023 Josh Jacobs, and those individual games have been very, very helpful. So again, you're looking at where do you find the profiles that are undervalued and how can you mix them into a lineup. And I really have a hard time believing this team is in first place because the receivers in rounds 2 and 3 have not dominated in the way that we need. The elite QB has not been healthy. The later wide receivers in Quentin Johnston, especially have not hit. And yet the structure, as you mentioned, gets us through. But now my excitement level for a team like this is extremely high for the reasons that you mentioned, which is that it's, again, not that they're going to be zero, but your advance rate for guys like Justin Fields are not going to be particularly high. You're going to have Achane sort of all over the map, because when he did play, his spike weeks were so valuable that there are going to be a lot of teams that are right on the brink with him. And if he comes back and scores, he's actually going to pull a lot of teams through. So they won't be that unique. But you have him in a situation where the injury means it's going to have knocked out some of the teams. So you're not going to be facing a full field of Achane teams in the playoffs.
Or a full field of fields. Sorry, I just wanted to say that.
You've really liked the wordplay. So I'm glad that you and Zachary are bringing puns for us with the show. Although I did like that one, I have to admit. But we're going to have T. Higgins, Jahan Dotson. You're going to have extremely low advance rates for those guys, which means that if and when they do hit, because Colm, especially Higgins, you're talking about a star there, then that's going to be the differentiator. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to draft teams that are so powerful that, and you're always obviously trying to do that, but you want to make sure that your structure allows it to be the case that you can have some misses and still be in the mix. Because if you do that, and if the player hasn't completely vanished, and Jahan Dotson's season has been so weird that, you could argue that he's completely vanished, and yet, just a couple weeks ago, he put up a couple decent weeks in a row, right? Now you have players who can be very high leverage guys when you need them the most. It almost helps you to get through a couple of these guys who have been disappointments. But the only way you can get disappointments through is you have to have the big hits, which means you have to target a certain profile, and then you have to have the structure, which means you have to have things like the RCE that you get through our suite of tools.
Exactly. I'm going to finish. Well, we're going to finish off, Shawn, on my favorite team that I have currently set up, and we're going to talk about it in a second. We mentioned the pun, something that I should have said on the Monday episode that came into my head. So CD Lamb set a record that no other player in NFL history had set. So I think we should just call him CD Goat from now on instead of CD Lamb. Would that work?
Go with it.
Okay. Didn't get a no. So we'll see if that catches on. But the other part that I was going to mention is Zach did have a tweet. We're giving Zach a lot of airtime here today, but he did have a tweet just before we came on air, which I thought was relevant to the Sam Howell conversation, that he mentioned Sam Howell was taking 5.7 sacks per game, weeks 1 to 7. That we had a lot of conversation on here that it was one of the parts that was most negative about his game. But in the last 3 weeks, weeks 8 through 10, he's averaging just 2.3 sacks per game. But he also mentions that the passes or the targets per game to running backs have nearly doubled as the sacks have decreased. You mentioned last week about Gibson heading into that week. We had him in some of our rosters due to bye weeks last week. Week 8, his targets were 5, or then week 9, 5, week 10, 6. But that's a big decrease in terms of the sacks that he has taken, which is very positive, obviously, for the Commanders and for Howell. His targets to the running back in weeks 1 to 7, 4.7 per game, now up to 8.7. So again, with Brian Robinson, with Gibson, positive news for their potential targets and usage moving forward. And Gibson is having a pretty nice run on the season for himself. But Shawn, this team that I have pulled up on the screen for anyone watching over on the YouTube side of things, drafted from the 2 spot. The reason I pulled up this is I looked at some of the highest scoring teams this week. There was a team in one of the leagues that I'm competing in, 215.5 points it put up in this Superflex contest this week with a Dak Prescott, Jalen Warren, Gibson, CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans, TJ Hawkinson, Baker Mayfield, George Kittle. So real heavy hitters this week in that lineup. And I was like, this team's incredible. Can anyone beat it in this contest? It has 1,578 points. And then I decided I'll just check if I have any teams that are close to it. Turns out I have 2 teams that are beyond that. So the team that I've pulled up here, is not actually my highest scoring team. It's the second highest scoring. It's 1,576. The other team is 1,590. This is over in the FFPC Superflex contest. But this is a Jalen Hurts stacked with A.J. Brown, Amon-Ra, St. Brown paired with Jared Goff, T. Higgins, who we mentioned already, but it's a Kenneth Walker, Javonte Williams team with Brian Robinson, who we were talking about a second ago. It also is A-Chain, Chuba Hubbard, Kendry Miller, Shawn Tucker. But then at wide receiver, some players that haven't hit, Dotson's in there, Shawn, as we mentioned, but George Pickens, Quentin Johnson, Wendell Robinson, wide receiver Sam Laporta, who is also paired there with Jared Goff. Logan Thomas is the other tight end, giving impact to it. But with this roster and then moving into getting Achane back, I'm pretty excited about the stretch run for this team.
That is pretty awesome, Colm. Blair and I have one of our Patriot-themed teams in first place, put up 211 this week, and had Jonathan Taylor on the bench. Josh Allen fails to make the Superflex spot. Instead, that goes to Dalton, Kincaid, Sam Laporta, Colt Kmet also there on the bench. Jahan Dotson on the bench because, again, he scored 0. That team also, as do so many, has J.K. Dobbins. So, again, a fun week. Some of the favorites, as you mentioned, guys like Devin Singletary and Tyler Boyd. This is probably my only Tyler Boyd team. He does have 19.7, but drops the touchdown at the end. Colm, 2023. So much fun. So many different ways to have gotten it done. This particular team, too, would be, I think, your absolute favorite because it's a TJ Hawkinson team. Colm, I know that you were doing very well in 2023 because you have a high percentage of TJ Hawkinson. It turns out that in Minnesota, with Kevin O'Connell, can't stop TJ Hawkinson.
You cannot stop him. It's interesting, though, Shawn, again, like the running backs and like the wide receivers, but there's a bigger pool, I guess, of wide receivers in general as we move down through the draft, and we're trying to draft more of those guys. But if we look at the quarterback pool, the tight end pool, the running back pool that we have gone from this year, it has been very successful. You mentioned Hawkinson. He was somebody that I continue to advocate for, but at his price, it was a little bit more tricky to pull off all the things we wanted. So there is Hawkinson teams out there that I'm happy with, but there is so many Sam Laporta, Trey McBride teams. A lot of that. And you had to wait on Trey McBride, but we'll see. I've seen people, Shawn, saying that rest of season, looking at which tight ends who would take ahead of him, and they're taking him as the option after those elite guys rather than Sam Laporta. They're taking him ahead of Sam Laporta. So I don't think I'm doing that quite yet, but I'm very excited for those tight end rooms that are built up in those drafts. But we'll see how it plays out. You mentioned J.K. Dobbins as well. And, over the last couple of weeks, you just think if he had been healthy in this team, I think he's the running back one because I think he's getting all the work that these running backs are getting over the last couple of weeks. But unfortunate with that injury, of course. That is going to do it for our second show of the week here on RotoViz Overtime. We will have our third edition coming out on Friday. Make sure to subscribe to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get that once it is available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.